Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. I will be passing you over to my colleague, Niamh Casey, momentarily, but first, I will be taking you through some housekeeping points. On joining the webinar, you have been automatically placed on mute. Time has been allocated for questions at the end of the webinar, and you can ask Niamh any questions you have using the question section of your GoToWebinar control panel. For any unanswered questions, feel free to get in touch with Niamh directly at niamh.casey@learnosity.com. And finally, just as a reminder that this webinar is recorded and the recording will be sent out to everyone that is registered afterwards. Thanks again for joining us, and I will pass you now over to Niamh.
Thanks, Sonia. So hello everyone, thank you for coming today. My name is Niamh Casey, as Sonia mentioned, and I'm an authoring expert here at Learnosity. So in today's webinar, we're going to be looking at how to author the graphing question type and the number line with plot question type. So I'm going to use the Learnosity author site for this, so we'll just head in there now. And I just have an empty item here, so I'm going to add a new question to it. Sorry about that. So I'll go to the graphing section of my question templates, and I can see both my graphing question template here and my number line with plot template. So as well as those, you'll see there's a graphing in the first quadrant template. So just to clear up any confusion here, they aren't two different question types. Graphing in the first quadrant is just the graphing question with some different configuration setup. So you can actually create that first quadrant question within the graphing template if you want to. We just created it to make your life a little bit easier. We've also got number line with plot, which we'll go over today. We do have number line with drag and drop too, but the configurations are very, very similar in both the templates. So we only really need to go over one. Obviously, the difference here is that you can plot, say, inequalities in the number line with plot question, whereas number line with drag and drop, the student can drag numbers, for example, onto a number line. So we'll go into the graphing question first of all. So this is our question editor here. On the left, you can see all of the different configurations. There is quite a lot in this question type. It's probably one of our more comprehensive question types. And then on the right, we can see the student preview. So we can see the graph, how it'll appear to the student. And we can also test it and see any changes we make as we go along, which is really useful. So, sorry about that. So I'm going to compose a question first of all. So I'll say, okay, so that's just your basic compose question box like we have in every question. There's nothing different in there that isn't in any of our other question types. And then you can set up the graph parameters. So you can set the minimum and maximum values on both the X and the Y axes. By default, they're set to 10.4. You can set them to whatever number you want, low or high. I'm going to keep these as they are now, but in the tools section, then you can configure the tools for the student toolbar, the buttons for the student toolbar. So they're visible in the top left of the student's toolbar. So the tools we've set up here by default are point and move. So they can plot a point, and then if they want to, they can move that point around. So I'll just undo that and undo. I can also add different tools if I want to by clicking on this add button underneath tools. There's tons of different ones to select from the drop-down menu. Let's just pick something random here, and I can see that's added to my toolbar. If I want to delete something, just the trash can icon as always. And then I can also add a group. So when I add a group, those buttons I put in the group will appear in a drop-down menu at the top in the student toolbar rather than as individual buttons. So just if you have a lot of different buttons that you want the student to use, you can use this option. So we'll just say label, line, segment, and so on. So then if I go to my student preview, I can see a new drop-down menu with my 3 label, line, and segment buttons available. So if I scroll down a little bit more, I can see the default tool option. So this, whatever I select here will be automatically selected for the student when the question loads for them. So it's by default set to point, but it can be, again, anything you want, and just saves the student from having to select that from their toolbar. And then further down, this is where I'll set up my validation. I'm not going to do that just now. I'll do that at the end because I want to go through some of the other options first. But I will go over this ignore repeated shapes option here. So we have 3 options in this drop-down: no, compare by slope, and compare by points. So the ignore repeated shapes option can cause a little bit of confusion. Basically, the reason it exists is because it's very easy for either an author or a student to place, for example, 2 lines on top of each other. So you can see here I plot a line. I can actually plot another line over that and another line over that and so on, but there's no way for me to tell just by looking at it that I've done that. So that's what we call repeated shapes. So we can set up here to ignore repeated shapes, and we can do that by either comparing the shapes by their slope or comparing by their points. So if I compare the shapes by the slope, it means that it will look at the 2 shapes, check that the slope is the same, and if it is the same, it'll say, okay, they're repeated shapes, yes, we'll ignore them. If I compare by points, it will take the 2 repeated shapes, it will check the points, see if they're the same, and if they are the same, it'll say, yes, they're repeated shapes, let's ignore those. Otherwise, I can set it to no, so it'll take the repeated shapes into account in validation. So for example, if the author accidentally set up 2 lines on top of each other and ignore repeated shapes was set to no, the student would have to set 2 lines on top of each other as their answer to get the question correct. 1 wouldn't be enough. So it is important to know what this one does. So I'll just reset this. Okay, so let's go down to more options here. We do have our scoring section, which is the same as in any of our question types. There's nothing unique to the graphing question here. Then in the layout section, we can configure the width and the height of the actual graph you see here. And as well as that, we can configure the margin. So that's just the white space between the graph and its border. So I set to 0 by default. I can set it to something like 25, and you can see the white space there at the edge of the graph. Set that back to 5. This snap to option here, by default, is set to grid, but you can actually type in this box. So grid just means that when I plot a point or anything on the graph, the point will snap to the closest grid line. If I can change that as well to ticks. So it accepts grid, it accepts ticks, which again is the very same, it just snaps to the closest tick. But I can also enter a numeric value in here, so I could say something like 0.5. And then if I go along and plot a point, it will plot the point every 0.5 on the graph. Okay, so we'll just change that back to grid. Draw label 0 here just refers to whether or not we show the 0 numeric label on the graph. And then display position on hover is turned off by default, but if I turn it on and I plot something on the graph, if I hover over it, I can see the coordinates. So you can turn that on or off, and it is off by default. Then if I scroll down a little bit more, I have my grid configurations here. So I can configure the x-axis and the y-axis separately, so they don't have to be the same. So the x distance and the y distance is just referring to the distance between the grid lines. So at the moment, you can see on the y-axis that number 1 is on a grid line, number 2 is on a grid line, and so on. And that's because we have the y distance set to 1. So if I change this distance to 2, you'll see that the grid line appears on every second label. So 2, 4, 6, and so on. Whereas the tick distance is the distance between the ticks rather than the grid lines. So by default, it's set to 1, so a tick appears at every 1 value. If I change this to 2, a tick will appear at every second value. The thing about the tick distances as well that you probably see here is that because I have it set to every second value, it won't show the number 1, 3, 5, it won't show the numbers between every second value. It will just show every second value and the ticks corresponding to it. Then further down here, I can show my axes labels. So that's just the X and Y labels that you see on each axis, but I can also change those to be whatever I want. So they're X and Y by default, but I could have them be any other letters, any words, numbers, whatever. And that input box will appear when you enable the axes labels, otherwise you won't see that box. Then if I want to hide ticks or hide numeric labels, I can do that too. So the hide ticks option is off by default, but if I turn it on the y-axis, you can see that my ticks disappear beside my letters. Turn it back off. And then with draw labels, that will turn off the actual numeric labels alongside the ticks. So again, on my y-axis, if I turn my labels off, they'll disappear. It's very faint, but you can see my ticks still. But I can also go back to my hide ticks and hide them, so I have no ticks or no numeric labels on my y-axis at all. So it's quite customizable. Then I can also show or hide the min arrow and max arrow on both my axes as well. That's what these options are for here. And then lastly, you have this comment and label option. So this is really only useful if your numeric values are 1000 or greater. And if you have this enabled and your numeric values are 1000 or greater, it will automatically put a comma in as a 1000 separator for you, so you don't have to do that yourself. But you can turn that off either if you want to. Then we have our controls. So the controls are not like the buttons here, they're everything on the top right of the toolbar. So this undo, redo, and reset button. There's a fourth option as well, which is delete, which you can also enable. That's not set up by default. So this will obviously allow the student to undo and redo their last actions. They can reset the graph completely and wipe it, or they can delete certain elements from the graph as well. Okay. And then we can also annotate our graph. So we can give it a title. So let's just maybe like so. And we can also label the top, left, right, and bottom as well. So that will appear just above the arrow, below the arrow, and to the left and right of the arrows as well. And again, with those labels, we can have them be numbers, letters, words, whatever you want. And then just a couple more sections down here, background image and background shapes, and then that's kind of graphing covered. So you can upload a background image here under the add image section. So we'll just click add now and upload something. You can also embed an image that exists elsewhere online if you want to, just in the more options tab on the pop-up box. Click OK when you're done and you'll see the image. So that image is obviously a bit stretched out and pixelated. So I can play around with the width and the height percentages here just to make the image, actually I'll change it to 50, just to make the image a little bit smaller. I can also change the image position on the graph by entering in some coordinates. So say 2 and 2, and it moves around the graph. And I can also set the opacity to make the image a little bit more transparent, just in case it kind of overpowers the ticks or the labels or anything on your graph. So again, set that to 30, and you can see it fades quite a bit. Then with the background shapes, you can actually plot shapes here, anything that the student can plot. So, you know, you see here parabolas, sine, polygon, circles, more options here. You can plot points, lines, anything like that. And let me just plot something. So we'll just plot a triangle here. So and here. Okay, and you'll see on the right it appears in grey. So that means that the student can't interact with it when it's a background shape. They can't modify it, move it around, delete it, do anything with it. It kind of behaves like a background image does. So just to bear that in mind, and it will always appear in grey. So when the student plots their points and their shapes on the graph, those will appear in blue, so that you can always differentiate between the two. So we'll just go back up here. And now we can also validate our question. So if I just go up here and plot, I can see that my my shape appears in blue. So we'll do segment and we'll do 5 here. And we're done. Okay, and that's it. It's really, really simple. So you could plot the graph in question without going into this more options section at all, but the more options section just allows you to really customize the graph itself to exactly what you want. So I'm just going to save that now onto our item, and we'll go in now and we'll look at the number line plot question. So just click add to add a new question, back to the graphing section again, and we'll go to the number line with plot section. So if I click on this, you can see here again, we have our question editor on the left and we have our number line on the right. So I'm just going to type in my question stem. And here I'm going to use my math editor. So I'm going to open it up here. It's the sigma symbol in the toolbar. And I'm going to just type in my inequality. Okay, when you're happy, click OK. And that's done. So now I could set up my minimum and maximum values on my number line. So they're 10 by default, 10 and minus 10. So I'm just going to make this a little bit smaller. And then you can give it a title. So the title will actually appear within the number line container, just above the number line in grey. And you can also set the number of responses that the student can add to the number line. So you can really limit this. So for example, I'm just going to set this to 1 now, so that if the student tries to enter more than 1 response, their response options here will become disabled and they can't actually click on them. So if I go in now and set my correct answer, I select the answer I want from the toolbar. I click on where I want it to go, and then I can just drag it up to the value I want. And that's it. And you can see, just like for the student, I can't click on any more response options now. It's totally disabled. So there's no issue there where the author might set like 2 or 3 correct responses when the number of responses allowed has only been set to 1. And then if you want to delete anything, you just click on the trash can icon, click on the section of the number line you want to delete, and that's done. So we'll go down to the more options section now. And again, our scoring section is the very same as with any of our other auto score question types. Down in the layout section, you can set your number line to be either horizontal, like it is by default, or you can set it to be vertical as well. So it's up to you, whichever you prefer. I'll set that back to horizontal. You can also change the width just to make the number line a little bit shorter. So say 450, you can see it's shrunken down a little bit. And again, you have your line margin like you did in your graphing question. So you can control a bit of the white space that appears around your number line. So set this to 20, for example, and you can see the white space really increases around my number line. You have also an option with the number line called stack responses. So if I turn that on, it just means that when I go to plot my response on the number line, it'll actually appear above the number line. So it's still in the right place, but just above it rather than directly on top of it. So it might be useful if you have multiple responses that you want the student to plot on the number line. They just won't be overlapping each other, it won't get messy. So I'll just turn that off. So if you do want to use your stack responses, then you can also control the spacing between those responses and how close or how far away they are from each other. You also have your min and max arrow, obviously, just your arrows at the left and right of your number line. You can show or hide those if you want to. Then you can configure the toolbar. So at the moment, we see all of the response options that you can possibly have in this question in the toolbar. It's just by default, but you can limit these if you want to just a couple. For example, the delete icon never goes away, so there'd be no issue there where the author might accidentally remove the delete icon and then the student can't change their answer. It's always there. And then finally, we have our ticks and labels sections. So with the ticks, they're obviously showing by default, as you can see. I can turn them off. The thing with the ticks is that if I turn off the ticks, it also disables the numeric values as well. So the numbers and the ticks will disappear. The min and the max are treated differently, so you'll have to also disable those separately as well. So I can have my number line with no numbers. Then you can set up tick distance as well. So it's set up to be 2 by default here, so you can see every second number and then the max and the min. If I set this to 1, I can now see every number between 1 and 5 and -1 and -5. So set that back to 2. And then with the minor ticks, those are just the ticks that appear in between your your number labels, your numeric labels on the number line. So they're set to 1 now. I can have 2 minor ticks, 3 minor ticks. You can see that change there, and so on. And then I can also change the rendering base. So this is just the number that the beginning number in the number line. So it's set to 0 here, but I can set it to be the line minimum value. So for example, if my number line started at 5 and went to 20, instead of having 0 there and then 5 and then all the way up to 20, I can just have the minimum value, which would be 5. So there'd be no 0 on the number line. And then lastly, we just have the labels. So I can decide to show my labels or hide them. Again, they're showing by default, as you can see clearly. If I turn them off, they'll disappear, but the ticks will remain. So unlike when I get rid of the ticks and the numbers disappear, when I get rid of the numbers, the ticks will remain. I can also set this to display specific points on the number line that aren't showing right now. So I can set it to display 1, for example. I can also set it to display more than 1. just separate them with a comma. You don't need to even put in a space here after the comma, just a comma will do. Let me see. You can also enter stacked fractions in here as well. So I have a half here. You can enter decimals, whatever you want. And then you can also set this to show the minimum and show the maximum as well. So again, if I hide the min, hide the max, it'll hide the number, but it won't hide the tick. Okay. So I can see here we have a few questions. I'm just going to look through them now. I'm going to actually get back to each of you individually because there's actually quite a few questions that have come in. So I'm going to do that right now when I get off this. We have about 10 or 12 questions that have come in. So I'm just going to go through those afterwards and reply to you all. Okay, so that's it. Thank you so much for your questions and thank you so much for attending. We will send on the recording of this webinar to you later on in the week. And yeah, that's it. So we'll see you at the next one.